going to be in Mark chapter 10. Mark chapter 10, beginning this next chapter together this morning. And we're going to dive into a passage today that, honestly, Christians have disagreements about. So I'm really excited about it. Yes. Sarcasm. Not only that, but most people in general have opinions or disagreements about this. And so although I'm aware of the disagreement, my desire this morning is to teach this text clearly and honestly as possible. And I'm not trying to choose or appease any one group or position on the matter. I'm just trying to get to the heart of it in Scripture. And I could be wrong about some of these things. There is some aspects of it where there's legitimate debate on it. And so I'm just trying to be honest and be as clear and straightforward as possible with it. So Mark chapter 10, starting in verse 1. And he arose from thence and cometh into the coasts of Judea by the farther side of Jordan. And the people resort, that is, they gather unto him again. And as he was wont, or as was his custom, he taught them again. And the Pharisees came to him and asked him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife, tempting or testing him? And he answered and said to them, What did Moses command you? And they said, Moses suffered, or permitted, to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. And Jesus answered and said to them, For the hardness of your heart he wrote you this precept. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So then they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And in the house his disciples asked him again of the same matter, and he saith unto them, Whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. And if a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery. Now, something that will help us this morning is looking at the parallel passage, which is in Matthew chapter 19. So if you want, you can turn there. Matthew chapter 19. It gives a little expansion of this conversation that Mark doesn't give. And so it would behoove us to read this. Matthew chapter 19, starting in verse 3. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, testing him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Now this part of their question got left out of the Mark text, but what they're asking is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said to them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, Whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. His disciples say unto him, If the case of the man be so with his wife, it's not good to marry. But he said unto them, All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So in preparation for today's sermon, I read a whole bunch of articles, listened to a whole bunch of sermons, did my usual research, except the topic was marriage and divorce. So Google thinks that I'm about to get a divorce. Okay? That's what's going on. So it's a good thing my wife knew what I was searching this week. She's like, why are all these ads coming up for marital counseling? And seriously, my Google's all messed. I've been getting YouTube commercials for What would you do if your spouse sat down next to you and said, I want out. We can help you. This for $19.99. Anyway, all right. So Google thinks that I'm about to get a divorce. So that's fun. So we have to ask some questions about this text that will help us get to the heart of the matter. So why were they asking Jesus the question? This is important to this discussion. What's the text say? Why did they ask him the question? Anybody? Yeah? Well, they said it was to test him. It's a trick. This isn't the first time they've done this. They're trying to get him to say something to mess something up. They're trying to trip him up somehow. Now the question is, what was the trick? What were they up to? Sometimes when the Pharisees are trying to trick Jesus, which is impossible, but sometimes when they're trying to trick Jesus, they're like, the text sometimes tells us why. This one doesn't tell us, so we have to just kind of think a little bit and look at some historical context, but there's a couple of possibilities. One would be to get him to talk about divorce in a way that would either discredit him as a teacher or upset the crowds. They don't like the fact that he's got a crowd he's teaching there. He wants to upset the crowd. Or maybe to get him in trouble with Herod. Because remember, John the Baptist kind of talked about him marrying his brother's ex-wife and made a big deal out of that, and he ended up being arrested for that. So keep in mind, the Pharisees, they really want to get Jesus out of the picture. So maybe if he talks about divorce, maybe he'll get arrested like John the Baptist. We can take care of this. I think what's more likely and what is more commonly understood by scholars is that it's the first trick that they're trying to do here. Because at the time, there were two schools of teaching, or two schools or two interpretations of the law in regards to divorce and remarriage. One was more restrictive, one teaching, and one was so unrestrictive that my understanding is that they would allow divorce over pretty much anything. In other words, the husband could one day be like, you burnt the toast, time to get a new wife. It's just like absolutely ridiculous, like literally over anything, just call it a day, I'll find someone else to be married to. As you saw in the Mark passage, it seems that women could also, even in that culture, divorce their husband. That would have been a rarer case at the time. But that's what this conversation seems to be about. The school of no-fault divorce, as we would call it today, was apparently the widely accepted interpretation and application of the law. In other words, that would have been normal. It would have been normal to divorce for any reason at all. So the Pharisees knew that this was a divisive issue amongst the teachers. They knew there was a current social opinion on this divisive issue, much like today. So at best, they were trying to discredit him or put him at odds with the crowds. At worst, they're trying to hope to be the death of him somehow with Herod. So what did they ask? What's their question? They're asking, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for any reason at all? One other thing I have to mention, it's not always obvious, but the subcontext of the divorce question is about the morality of remarriage. Because you have to be legally divorced before you can be legally married to someone else. That's the whole subcontext of the question. And we know that because that's how he's in the process of answering the question about, he brings up remarriage. They have this in mind when they're asking this question. Because there's this big deal about if you have the bill of divorcement, if you have the piece of paper and you want to marry someone else, you can prove legally, no, I can do it. I have the piece of paper that says I'm no longer married to this person. So that's why it's important. If it wasn't for the remarriage aspect, you wouldn't need that bill of divorce at all. So I want to add the subcontext of their question to the question. You could ask it like this. Is it morally acceptable to divorce our wife for any reason at all so that we can marry someone else? That's the question. That's the norm. That's the cultural norm at the moment. Do it for any reason at all so we can just marry someone else. That's really what they're getting at with this question. And we're going to get to his answer in a moment. In his response to this question, one of the first things or early things that he does is define what marriage is by quoting or referencing Genesis chapter 2. Jesus said, quote, "From the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So then they are no more twain, but one flesh." So this definition, like I said, it's in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. It's given early in the Bible. It's a foundational institution given by God. Now, I got to point this out. We read in the Matthew text. He told his disciples this. He mentions that not everyone is commanded to get married. There's some teaching out there that implies that everyone is supposed to get married, and if you don't seek marriage, there's something wrong with you, and you need, there's a teaching out there. That's not what the Bible says. Paul didn't teach that. Jesus didn't teach that. That's not what Genesis is teaching us, that everyone has to be married. That's not what the text teaches. I just want to clear the room on that. I'm not teaching that, but there are people that teach that. In fact, what Jesus tells them is some people are called to remain single, or a better word for us today would be to be called to celibacy. Because some people say, "Oh, I'm called to singleness," but they're not celibate. So that's not what that means. So that's to remain single and to have no sexual relations, because that's reserved for marriage. Okay, so some are called to singleness, some are called to marriage. For those who do desire marriage, they desire a good thing. It's not that everyone's commanded to do it, but it is a good thing for those that do pursue and seek out marriage and have marriage. But what is it? But what is marriage? Well, that would take a lot longer than just today's sermon, and we wouldn't even get to the issue at hand. And so we're going to have to get to that a different day. In fact, we'll probably do a sermon series on marriage at some point, because I can't do that in one setting. But it would be good for us to do that. Marriage is more than just a definition, right? For it involves the union of two unique souls made in the image of God. And if God blesses, it also involves the children that are produced in that union. Genesis 2:24, which Jesus quoted, is commenting on the first union of the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, right? So it's saying something to the reader about what this moment in Genesis teaches us. Genesis does this sometimes. It steps out of the narrative to give an application of truth. So it steps out of this narrative of Adam and Eve to then describe the significance of their union. Once again, it says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." Ray Ortlund, he's the president of Renewal Ministries, wrote an article in 2015 to help break down this definition, and I really think it's a beautiful way. And so instead of me saying it, I'm just going to quote what he said, because I thought it was really nice. He wrote, "A man shall leave his father and his mother. In a culture of strong bonds between the generations, this is striking. A man's primary human relationship is no longer with his parents or ancestors. He breaks away from them for the sake of a more profound loyalty and hold fast to his wife. A man in marrying enfolds his wife into his heart. He rejoices to identify with her. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," as it says in verse 23. "At every level of his being, he becomes wholeheartedly devoted to her as to no other. And they shall become one flesh." One flesh is essential to the biblical view of marriage. It means one mortal life fully shared. Two selfish me's start learning to think like one unified us, sharing one everything, one life, one reputation, one bed, one suffering, one budget, one family, one mission, and so forth. No barriers, no hiding, no aloofness. Now total openness with total sharing and total solidarity until death parts them. He went on to write this. "What we see then is that marriage is not a product of human social evolution. Marriage came down from God, and He defined it for us. He has the right to. It belongs to Him. One mortal life fully shared between a man and a woman. This is marriage according to the Bible." So after that, Jesus added this statement, "What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." So marriage is a sacred covenant And when a man and woman commit to the covenant of marriage, Jesus described it as a spiritual covenant that God is directly involved in. That he is directly involved in joining the two together to become one flesh. So Jesus concludes that because of the spiritual significance of marriage, that it is something that people should not dissolve or separate. So what is the Christian ideal for a Christian marriage? A Christian marriage is meant to be a committed, lifelong, monogamous relationship that is founded in the love of Jesus, that is pursuing the glory of God in a unified togetherness. A relationship that is built on selfless love and mutual respect. Unfortunately, now we get to go to the not so fun part. The biblical and ideal marriage that I just described is not always what marriage is in reality. Sadly and despicably, we live in a reality where people abandon and abuse the one they're supposed to cherish and love. We live in a world where people look for and practice carnal sexual pleasures that are intended to be exclusive with their spouse. In other words, marriage as an institution is beautiful and a grace from God. But all marriages are not beautiful or graceful. Sometimes it's utterly ugly. Why? Jesus said, because some people have hard hearts. Therefore, divorce is in certain cases permitted because some people have ugly, hard hearts. So what is Jesus' answer to the Pharisees' question? Jesus said, I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, that is sexual immorality, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. And if a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery. They asked, is it morally acceptable to divorce our wife for any reason at all so that we can marry someone else? And Jesus' response is a clear no. It's not morally acceptable. If you divorce your spouse for any reason at all, just so you can be permitted and be morally acceptable, socially acceptable to marry someone else, all that you've done is committed adultery. So while Jesus admits that there is allowances for divorce, he knows what his questioners are getting at. He's aware of the social issues at hand, and he's saying that the sacredness of marriage covenant has become no more than a joke to them. Even Jesus' disciples were shocked at his response. So this is such a prevalent thought. Even his own disciples were like, well, this is a heavy teaching. What do you mean that's adultery? Like, who would get married then? If I can't divorce over any reason, who would get married then? They were so shocked, they had to ask him about it again in private. Like, can you repeat that adultery part again? Can you explain this to me? And he verified it for them. He told them that divorce was being used for an excuse to commit adultery. So, take it seriously or stay single, but don't cheapen the marriage covenant. That being said, the obvious question is, well then, what type of divorces are considered permissible? And this is where the Christian debate ensues. When does the Bible explicitly give allowance for divorce? Well, as we saw in Matthew 19, last week our recording got messed up. It'd be great if this part just didn't make the internet. I don't want the heat. Well, as we saw in Matthew 19, Jesus gives an allowance for a morally acceptable divorce and potential future marriage on the grounds that a sexual sin has been committed by her spouse. The word used here in the Greek is a broad term that seems to reference any type of sexual sin, not limited to adultery. Some limit it to unfaithfulness, to adultery. Others broaden that, say it's any sexual sin. It's not limited to that. It could be a pornography addiction, etc. Okay, to be clear, the teaching here isn't that such sin requires a divorce. If you have a spouse that has been unfaithful, if you have a spouse that has some sexual sin, it doesn't necessarily require a divorce. But if it's absolutely necessary, it's permissible in this case. In another passage, in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul talked about marriage and divorce. He said that you should not divorce or abandon your spouse, and that if you have done that already, that you should attempt to reconcile the marriage, assuming that either the person is not already remarried or remains single. Okay, so he was teaching about on marriage, what a Christian marriage should look like. He said, hey, if you've divorced your spouse or abandoned your spouse, hey, try to reconcile that. You shouldn't have done that, right? Assuming that it was a divorce that didn't have biblical grounds. It's like, all right, we need to fix that. You shouldn't just do that. He said, even if your spouse is not a Christian, you should not divorce or abandon them, assuming there's a disagreement or conflict about that. But he also taught that if your non-believing spouse abandons you, you are not required to reconcile that marriage, implying that in that case, divorce and remarriage would be permissible. And there's a whole lot of, I'm not going to get into this, but there's a whole lot of debate of when something is considered abandonment of an unbelieving spouse. Once again, divorce is not required in the case of being abandoned, but it is taught to be morally permissible if it becomes necessary. Okay. So these are the two explicit times that divorce, if it comes to that, is considered morally permissible. But I must also briefly mention an implication exists between these two texts. In Matthew, Jesus didn't mention the allowance that Paul mentioned. And in Corinthians, Paul doesn't mention the one that Jesus mentioned. This at least implies that neither of them necessarily taught that their allowance for divorce was the only allowance for it, but they gave the most serious offenses as examples as opposed to the any reason or no fault divorce concept. And that is why it is a gray area of debate amongst God-loving believers. Both Jesus and Paul, when teaching on marriage and divorce, gave strong words. Jesus said, like we read, God put it together, don't dissolve it. Paul said, don't get divorced. If you did, try to remedy that relationship. They both led the conversation with the design of marriage and the ideal for marriage. They led with what should be protected and fought for. Marriage is good. Marriage is from God. Don't abandon it. But in light of that goal and ideal, both Jesus and Paul acknowledge that in light of our sin-cursed and broken world, that unfortunately there are cases where allowances must be permitted. Not because anybody wants that. When someone's talking about divorce, it's not like people got married wanting divorce to occur at some point. A lot of things happen between there and there. So what is the conclusion of the matter of marriage, divorce, and remarriage? To married Christians and to those Christians who intend to pursue marriage, our desire and intention in and for our marriage or future marriage should be a loving, lifetime commitment that is not easily wavered by the ups and downs of life or the normal difficulties that can occur in the marital relationship. In other words, protect your marriage, pursue your spouse, grow in togetherness. Okay? When it comes to divorce, it would seem that for the married Christian, divorce should be strongly avoided and definitely should not be because of any reason at all. And that even in difficult situations, marital restoration should be pursued, but that if after that pursuit is exhausted, the marriage is still found to be unredeemable, God gives allowances for divorce. So in conclusion, if I were to summarize that, it would be marriage is a sacred, God-given institution and is worth fighting for, and divorce should be a rare and unfortunate occurrence because of an irredeemable bad situation, or if you will, an irredeemable, ugly, hard heart within a marriage. That's a lovely topic today. What I really want to conclude with is a couple of thoughts that I didn't get to finish fully developing somewhere between my computer crashing and not coming back. There's a few different thoughts here. If it wasn't clear already, obviously, the number one goal is to protect, preserve, grow marriages and togetherness. But all divorce isn't sin, as some have implied or said. The wording that Paul uses in Corinthians to an abandoning, unbelieving spouse, he says, if you look at the Greek, what he says is, you're not required to go back to that enslavement. You don't have to be a slave to that situation. So even Paul's using terminology that's like, no, you don't worry about that one. Move on from that. But getting there should be hard, right? And so when we talk about it, we want to be careful because you're not encouraging it, but you don't want someone to feel like they can't if it has to get to there, or if they've had to be there. That being said, I want to end with what God did. So if you get a chance, read Jeremiah chapter 3. And God, the God who says he hates divorce, has this moment where you have Israel's divided into two nations. You have Israel and Judah. And Israel is worshiping all kinds of pagan gods. And God often referred to his relationship with Israel as they're his bride, and he is their husband. And it's a theme, it's an analogy. It doesn't mean literally, it's an analogy, it's a strong covenant bond he's trying to express between them. And in Jeremiah chapter 3, the affair that Israel, the kingdom of Israel, was having with pagan gods was so bad that God says, I've had to give you a bill of divorcement. So you have God figuratively having a divorce. But the amazing part of that story is even after he figuratively divorces Israel, the very next verses say, will you come back? So the example that God gives for us in that situation is even after the line of divorce, there's still hope for restoration in some cases. But that just shows and expresses how great God's love is. And the very, very last thing is God also talks about his relationship to the church, to the bride, as the bride, and him, the husband, and him preparing the church, preparing his bride. And God is not like the abandoning, unbelieving spouse. God doesn't, if you will, cheat on us. He is faithful. He provides. He protects. He pursues. He never leaves nor forsakes. And so what we have in God, in his relationship to us as the church, and his love for us as individuals, is a flawless relationship. To where even when we're not holding up our part of the covenant, if you will, he still loves and provides and protects and is growing. And the Bible says that he's the good work that he has begun in us, that he will finish it. And so within that difficult topic and debated topic and not fun conversation at all about divorce, the main takeaway I really would want us to walk away with today is that we have a good God who will not abandon us, who will not walk away from us, will finish what he has started in us. And we can find rest and comfort and joy in our relationship with God as the church. If at any point any of you guys have any questions or concerns about anything that I said, or want me to clarify anything that I said, I would be more than happy to do that at any given time. The sermon wasn't flawless, and there was many other aspects which I wasn't able to get into today.